This is the Denver Erlang and Elixir meetup for Monday, March 4th, 2024. The meetup tonight is sponsored by Praxio.io, which is the best Elixir support you can get from a security vendor today. So if you're using Elixir, please check it out. Very excited to introduce the speaker tonight. I met Andrés at ElixirConf last year in person. He's going to be speaking tonight about his first year with Elixir. He's been doing some really incredible things and contributing to the community.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrés Alejos. As Michael said, well, first, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Praxio, for inviting me to speak. Nice to meet everybody here. This is my first Elixir meetup. I went to ElixirConf in September last year, and that's where I met Michael. And he kindly invited me to speak about my experience, my first year with Elixir. So this is going to be a bit of a kind of a journey type talk. It might be a little bit winding, but I have kind of a stream of experiences that I thought would be interesting to some people in terms of how they could also kind of get into Elixir, contributing open source, and specifically, I've been particularly interested in the machine learning and Livebook. So right here, if you want to follow me, these are my socials. The projects I'll kind of refer to are on my GitHub. They're all on there. Funny enough, one of them now, because it's a smart cell and I ended up refactoring this weekend to Vue, actually says it's a Vue project, but it's actually Elixir. I don't know if that's an indictment on how much Vue I ended up writing for it, or if that's a testament to how much you can get done with Elixir and how little Elixir you can write and still make really cool stuff. And my website there is where I also put out writings, different like blog, technical articles, stuff like that. So kind of what is this talk going to be about? So I started programming Elixir. I was introduced to it in like November 2022, but didn't really hit the floor running like programming with it until around March or April of 2023. So it's been roughly a year of me kind of full throttle working on it. And I really just do it in my free time because I like the language and I've been having a lot of fun with it. And it's the most fun I've been having programming, so much so that I really want other people to experience this. I like talking and meeting with people who also work with Elixir because they tend to just be very high-spirited people, because you can get so much done with Elixir that it's really hard to just be like kind of dragging your feet in the mud with it. So it feels like that kind of reflects in the personality of the people you tend to meet. I wanted to share my experience and offer potentially a guide to how I could do this. The overlay isn't in the way, right? Just making sure.
Oh
There's
yeah,
like a Zoom overlay. Okay.
You look good. It's good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So my kind of what I want people to get out of this is basically Elixir is a great language to make your open source home. So this is a brief time of kind of my experience with Elixir. I was first introduced to it in around November of 2022. I actually have a friend I work with, and I saw him at we saw each other at like a Super Bowl party or something, and I was like, "Hey, what are you working on?" And he said, "Oh, I'm working on Elixir. I'm writing a book for it. I'm doing some really cool stuff with it. You should check it out." And he was trying to tell me how good of a language it was, and I was surprised that I'd never heard of it. I had done machine learning in my past and had been working with it, and he was in the machine learning ecosystem, so I figured I would have heard about it, but I hadn't. So I was like, okay, this sounds really cool. You should tell me more. So he told me more. I kind of asked how I could contribute. He pointed me to Scholar, and Scholar, for those who don't know, is traditional machine learning in Elixir, whereas something like Axon is neural networks, and NX itself is just like a generic numerical computing library. So he pointed me towards Scholar in December 2022. And that's when I had my first contribution, very, very minor. I think it was just implementing Hamming distance in it. And I don't even think that my implementation is in it anymore. But it was enough to dip my toe into it and kind of experience what the Elixir community is like very early on. Then I took like a 4-month break without really touching it. And then I got back to working on EXGBoost. And this basically started from talking with that friend again and asking him, "Hey, what is there that there is to do? I like what you're working on. It seems like there's kind of room here for contributions." And he said, "Oh, we don't actually have a decision tree library yet because of the way the decision trees are trained. We actually don't think it's a proper fit for Scholar or NX or any of our existing libraries. But it would be really cool is if you wrote some bindings to an existing decision tree library. And at that time, I didn't really have any experience in NIFs, native implemented functions. That's Elixir's version of FFIs for those who don't know, basically how you can escape the beam, the VM, and talk with native code. I didn't really have any experience with that at this point, but I thought it sounded interesting. So I went ahead and started working on that project. And as I got more involved with that, he basically came to me and said, "Hey, we think it'd be really cool if you implemented this thing that Microsoft has out. It's called Hummingbird, and this is basically a library that lets you compile decision trees into tensors." I gave my talk on this whole subject at ElixirConf. I know several of you were there, so I'm not going to go too in depth with it. If you want to see that talk, I'd recommend you go. I can post it in the chat if anybody's interested. So after I started working on Mockingjay, I went to ElixirConf US in 2023 and kind of met a lot of people there and had my first in-person experience with people from Elixir. Really nice crowd, really interesting talks, and really got to see kind of how direction, like how much of a direction there was. It didn't feel like a rudderless community whatsoever. It felt like there was a very well-defined direction with stuff like Ash and stuff like the NX project and all of that going on. And then more recently, I've started working with Livebook a lot more. And a good amount of this talk will be about Livebook because I talked a lot about the machine learning stuff I did in my ElixirConf talk. But that I think they all kind of pair well together. So going back to kind of my first impressions I have, well, this next kind of part of the talk is going to be a bit about like what Elixir looks like to somebody coming in new. The kind of the pros I noticed were I saw pipes and I fell in love instantly. They just made a lot of sense for me. And the first thing I saw with it was actually an axon neural network that was basically just 10 pipes in a row. And it just made a ton of sense to me because I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you look at forward propagation of a neural network. The code expresses what it is. It's like onomatopoeia in a way when you look at it. What I noticed was standardization and uniformity, mix for packages, hex for package hosting, hex docs and exdoc for documentation, exunit for testing. All of that just felt like it took a huge pressure off of me coming in because you don't have that sort of analysis paralysis of different options of what to choose from. You have these well-defined options that aren't just, like throw into the language. They're all very, very good and they're all actively being worked on. Exdoc in particular is still very actively worked on and very rich in different feature additions. Welcoming community, everybody who's here. I think that was one thing I noticed right off the bat is as soon as I started wanting to either ask questions, go on Elixir forum, kind of toss out around different ideas, people were very open to correcting you when you're wrong, but more in a sense of wanting to teach you as though like they had made that mistake before and they don't want you going down that same road. And I think that sort of character from the community goes a long way towards kind of helping people come in. And it was a very young ecosystem, and I'll kind of young in comparison. Obviously, Elixir now is 12 years old or so. So it's not super young, but in comparison to other stuff, you could consider it young. Some of the cons I noticed when I first started was the different mental model than what I was used to. I had luckily had a little bit of functional experience. I used Scala at school a little bit, and I'd worked with a little bit of functional programming, but not in big kind of production environments or in big systems. It's in, when you're doing it within the content or context of schooling, it's oftentimes like little toy projects or small isolated bits to a system, not really integrating them together. I was extremely confused as to what the heck Views did at first. I read over the documentation a little bit, actually a few times, couldn't really figure out the difference between that. Import, require, use, that differences tripped me up at first. Wasn't sure what OTP was. Basically, I had a book suggested to me that said that was called, I think, like Designing Systems with OTP. And nowhere in the book title or in the first few pages, because I was looking at the preview, did it actually tell you what OTP was. So, in the same thing with a lot of the Elixir documentation at first, it just kind of works under the assumption that you know what some of these concepts are, like OTP and some of the Erlang concepts. incomplete tooling insofar as especially the LSP. And I know that a lot of the work being done with typing right now is being done to help bridge this. And Mitchell over at the Elixir Tools team is working really hard. And I know I saw some recent sponsorships going on in this direction. So that's really encouraging. Big thing I noticed, copies not being performant. I wrote a lot of really, really bad code at first that was very slow. And I think a lot of it is because you're not, your mental model when you're doing for loops and object oriented, where you can just mutate state, you don't really have to have the same considerations as when you're kind of looping over something, copying it. And then again, young ecosystem. Okay, so why do I mention all this? Why do I go through my timeline? Kind of why do I mention these first impressions I had? It's because I think it's really easy to understand why newcomers who are coming to Elixir might be discouraged. But I think once you get past that initial high barrier to entry, you can be extremely productive. And I've seen a lot of people talk recently about how they think you can get more done essentially with like 2 senior Elixir developers than you can with, 10 like junior developers or for other languages, stuff like that. Basically, you can get a lot a bang for your buck when you're working with Elixir. And you notice there, I put down kind of the caveat down there that the high barrier to entry, in my instance, I felt like it was a high barrier to entry, but that's definitely not going to be the case for everybody. I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. And actually, right now, yeah, so this is a bit of a tangent. I've seen a lot of talk about people talking about Elixir and how it's not very friendly of a language. Like it's hard to read. I saw one tweet that was kind of talking about how it's hard to read. And I actually think it's extremely easy to read. You just have to actually know the language. That's like asking somebody who's like never worked with Cyrillic to read Russian and say it's a hard language to read. I've only used the, like the Latin alphabet or something like that. So I think it's once you know the alphabet, the underlying language you're working with, it's way easier to read. I mean, that was a huge reason Elixir was even created because Jose identified Erlang and the Beam as being such a good foundation, but the syntax and some of the ergonomics of the language were not as newcomer friendly and just not as, even once you're well established, just not as easy to work with. So I think the bigger thing people's bigger complaint about this is that object oriented doesn't necessarily translate and oftentimes can even work against your fundamental understandings that you're working with. And so once you can get past that, then that's when you can really start hitting the ground running. You might have noticed though, you said young ecosystem was both a pro and a con. Like, what do you mean by that? So what I mean by that is you might be trying to write something and you might be in a situation where you're trying to justify switching to Elixir for your company and for a production product, and you end up having to rewrite a lot of stuff yourself because it's not available, and that can come at a big cost in time, right? There's a lot of times where it's just easier to go towards existing languages that have the solutions already built that are like all-in-one packages where you can do everything you want. So that can be a big con if you're looking at it from that perspective. But it also means you have a lot of free real estate to really be the person to bring something new to the language. That means you get to make it and you get to have an outsized impact. So right now I'm going to kind of talk about my experience contributing to open source. Some of the initial takeaways I'll just come out and say is it doesn't have to be intimidating. I recommend starting small in a niche you know well. You don't want to be somebody who's stepping on toes. And so you have to be very cognizant of kind of the lane you need to operate within to be, a good constituent of the open source community and not kind of be a bull in a china shop. You should really be able to reference good and well-known libraries that are well established. Things I looked at, and this was very easy to do with Elixir because the standard libraries are so well maintained, documented, very accessible, very easy to read. And oftentimes the easiest way to learn them is to read the actual source. You learn coding style. So basically you learn kind of the dialect of the language, if you will. I might have had my my context coming from Python or coming from Scala, or I'd worked a little bit with Julia before. Each of those different places has a dialect, kind of a style, but is associated with the language itself. And so you don't want to necessarily try to shoehorn that into a new language. Project management and best practices, just looking at how people interact with, pull requests, how people interact on code review, how people interact with their CI/CD platforms, GitHub Actions. You can learn a lot just from going to that. So I'd recommend people look that, look for existing libraries if you're looking for how you can contribute. Um, and lastly, kind of the initial tips, good developer experience. You're going to get a lot more adoption if somebody can just go to your repository, look for a section that says like, how do I develop or how do I contribute? They can pull down your repo and they can immediately start developing. That was something where for me, it was, you know, initially when I had a project, I wasn't getting, I had it out there, EXG Boost, and people were looking at it and people were trying to use it, but they had a hard time getting up and running. And I'm still kind of stepping on these rakes sometimes because, especially when you start involving native implemented functions where you either have to pre-compile or refer them to how to compile it. You have to have all the compilation dependencies. And especially once you involve something like CUDA, it can get really hairy how to set up a development environment. And that can be enough just to intimidate, not even intimidate, but somebody you're asking them to contribute to something that they don't have ownership over, and you're not making it as easy as possible for them to do. So that really disincentivizes them from doing it. So the better developer experience you can offer, the better adoption you're probably going to get. Next thing, I kind of look at this from a sense when I was looking at what I could do, and this is kind of before I decided on EXG Boost when I started working at, is this idea of like filling a gap in the market, right? I mentioned that there's a lot within Elixir that hasn't been done yet, and that leads to there being a huge gap in the market. And I even look back to how the creation of NX and that whole ecosystem came about. Basically, there was a book written called Genetic Algorithms in Elixir. Jose and I think Brian Cardarella from Dockyard saw it, said, hey, we hadn't considered doing machine learning in Elixir. Let's reach out to this author and let's see how we can integrate this. And then that's kind of how the NX project was born. There was a gap there that somebody just put out something and said, hey, this doesn't exist in here. Let's see if somebody wants to bite on this. And I don't even think he had that intention, right? So I kind of look at it this way: if you have high supply and low demand, you're probably going to have low adoption, and unless you really have to battle through other stuff. So this is kind of, if you want your first contribution to be something like a Python machine learning contribution, that might be really hard. You might have to really kind of ramp up to get to that, right? Because it might be really hard to get noticed in that sort of a sea of people, right? If there's high supply but also high demand, it's really kind of dependent on what the best quality is and how you get your stuff out there. If you have low supply and low demand, we don't even really need to talk about because nobody's really interested in that. But if you have low supply and high demand, you'll probably have high adoption, or at the very least, you'll get people interested in it, right? You'll get people asking questions. And so if you find at that intersection of like, you have a skill or you have an interest, you notice that it's being unmet here at one location, and you decide you're going to go out and address it, that can be a very nice way to get a foothold, right? And then once you have that foothold, then it's a lot easier for your work to get noticed, for you to get people contributing, and to kind of get the snowball rolling. And so I kind of looked at this as like Elixir points of entry, the different ways people might be introduced to Elixir. You have the back end, right? You have people who work with Elixir from the back end. You have people either coming from stuff like the JVM, or Ruby is a big community, people from Ruby, Go, Node, stuff like that, places where, different ecosystems, different communities where they have back. And what you get in return is you get scalability, concurrency, and distribution out of the box. Obviously, Erlang is what gives you most of that, and Elixir just gives you a nice front end for that. And then you have like front end / web development in a way, right? You have the Phoenix framework, which is a huge point of entry that people come to Elixir from. And they're coming from either JavaScript, Ruby on Rails, other frameworks like PHP, stuff like that, right? And then kind of the newest point of entry that you'll see is people coming from the machine learning realm. And that's less so of people, from what I've seen, that's less so people coming from existing points like Python. And it's more people who are already in Elixir and they decide, I want to add this. Instead of having to reach out to Python and add it, I can just work here, right? So that really just gives you the opportunity and gives you, as a language, the ability to say, here, we have this nice, cohesive, all-in-one system that you can work within. I think that's a really good offer that you can give somebody, like a really good value proposition, right? And so when I kind of thought about it from this perspective, I saw machine learning as one of the things I could kind of target. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. And this is if I were to come at it again, kind of how I would approach it is I'd look at it as, okay, this is an up and coming discipline. The ecosystem's still young. There's a high potential end user base kind of built in because there's a lot of people who want to use machine learning. And it's mostly dominated by one other kind of front end or high level language, that being Python. And there's a lot of people who escape to go to Python because that's the only option. And there's when I looked at it, you see, okay, Elixir has this great established web development ecosystem with Phoenix. That's one of the biggest things that draws people in. People who build web apps need machine learning models and need easy ways to access it. So this is definitely a place where it makes a lot of sense to start working with. And I already knew somebody working in it within Elixir, so he was able to kind of point me in the right direction, which of course always helps. And plus, I had experience; I'd worked with machine learning before. Um, Next, more recently I've kind of looked at Livebook a lot, and this is I'd already been using it for a lot of my machine learning kind of prototyping and stuff like that. But what I like about it is it's backed by Dashbit, and not just Dashbit; it's backed by a lot of different sponsors. And I like to think of it as like the ultimate front end to Elixir. Um, some people kind of called it. I saw some people shouting it out as like the next iteration of IEX, and it's extensible. And I believe I've worked with Jupyter quite a bit. I really thoroughly believe it's better. It's a better product than Jupyter, and it does what it's supposed to do better. Um, it just needs the surrounding ecosystem to kind of get more mature as well. So I kind of see Livebook as the perfect cross section, the intersection of machine learning, front end, documentation, which I'll talk about later, writing. It lets you do all of these things in one location and makes it very accessible. So, kind of the thesis I'm proposing here and kind of where I'm landing after my first year here is that Livebook is actually the perfect tool for onboarding newcomers, and it should be embraced. I kind of forgot to end that sentence there. Basically, it should be embraced by the community. It has a standalone installer, makes it really easy to not really know Elixir whatsoever and download it and get started with it. You have managed environments through Livebook teams and hubs. It's kind of a supercharged IEX in a way. You have three different runtime options. For those who don't know, you can run it standalone, meaning you download it and then you run it. You can run an IEX session, have your IEX be your node, and then attach to that node from Livebook, or you can do an embedded option, which you can basically pre-package it and then put it on edge devices where it's not going to be connected to the internet. And then it also has improving support, and this is a big focus from what I could tell, of prototype to production. This seamless transition between prototyping something to deploying it to production. So we're going to look a little bit at some Livebooks, some of the stuff I've been working on in case people haven't seen it, and kind of some of the stuff that really got me excited about Elixir. So I'll move over here. So one of the cool things, can everybody see this? Okay, cool. One of the cool things about Livebook, for those who haven't worked with it, is this kind of deployed apps. So if you go here and you go to your deployed apps, you can essentially create a Livebook and set it up such that all of the cells will get run and then deployed as an app. And you can even make it so that only like the rich outputs get rendered in your app. So I'll just give you an example. So I have this running example now, and it's called voice activity detection. So this is the URL. I have to create a new session because I made it a multi-session app. And basically right here, this is an app that what it'll do is I can hit record. It'll start streaming my audio, and it'll spike when it detects voices, and it'll filter out things that aren't voices that might be noise and other background noise. And you can actually with Livebook click up here and hit view source, and you can see entirely how this was done. And this is for something I was working on with a friend where he was trying to get this voice activity detection working. He had it working in the JavaScript, but he wanted it working in the server. So this iteration, this version actually uses Ortex, which those who don't know is the Onyx runtime, which allows you to basically package models to make them cross language. So the Onyx runtime takes care of actually running the model, and then you can write bindings and target that runtime. So like these bindings from Elixir, right? And this is pretty basic. like you create a new Vega Lite chart. For those who don't know, Vega Lite is an API for creating plotting library. You create these Keynote inputs, and you take in the input. You can give it some defaults. This is more setting up the input. This is setting up that grid of inputs right here. And finally, right here is where you start the listener, keynote.listen, and you attach it, basically listen for events emitted by this Keynote live audio. I don't actually know if the demo, if it'll work with my voice recording. We can check. Okay, let's see. Will this work? Okay. Yeah, there we go. And right now it's doing a sample rate of 16,000, chunk size of 1 second. So I can actually stop this and I can change this to, let's go milliseconds, and let's go 300 milliseconds. And we'll rerun the notebook. I'll re-record. Let me clear the plot. And here you go. And you can see it even filters out like snaps. So this was how I was able to kind of go about coming around with like a proof of concept that I could then hand off to my friend who was working on this this implementation. And so I did all of the proof of concept for it in Elixir on Livebook here. But one of the cool things about this is that Keynote, that this live listen actually isn't built in to Keynote. It's not a built-in Keynote. It's actually one that I ended up writing, but because Keynote is extensible, it was pretty straightforward to do this. So I have over here some examples. This might take a little bit to load, but here's some of the different ones. There's Keynote Live Audio. That's the one I just demonstrated you. There's Keynote YouTube that I did. And then Mercury is another one that I've worked on that I said I ended up doing a lot of view with. So right here, this is an example of Mercury. Basically, it was this idea I had where I wanted to get some more practice with smart cells. And this right here, I think, is a great learning tool. And when you look at like the intersection of all these different parts of Elixir that I've been speaking about, I think smart cells are a great demonstration of this. For those who haven't worked with smart cells are a way that you can define a user interface that persists with state, basically uses JSON. It'll encode the JSON as state that you can serialize, and it can keep that state. And then it can also do code generation. And that's, if you hit to smart cell here, you hit toggle source, and it'll show you the source that was used to generate this. So this is essentially like a Postman style cell where I can add different things. I can add my keys. This is meant to kind of be a Postman. You can toggle keys on and off. You can add headers. You can use the Livebook Vault, which is a pretty cool part that you kind of get for free baked in. And one of the cool things I liked that I really was embracing Rec, which is the underlying library doing this, is this idea of plugins. So I can come in here and I can look at some of the plugins that you use for Rec. Like if Rec has an S3 plugin, I can just hit copy. Well, let's do something like Rec Athena, just because it's the first one here. So I come Rec Athena. I can add it. I can rerun this. Wait for that to load. And when it's done, I'll have to refresh it, but then I'll be able to see that new plugin is installed. This is taking longer than I thought it would. Apologies. Hopefully it's not trying to redo everything. It might be because Bumblebee's in there. Bumblebee could take a while. There we go. So if I come back to plugins, I hit refresh, now I have Rec Athena available here, and I can toggle this on and off, and it'll actually give you the code. So right here, it then attaches it according to the plugin interface. So smart cells are another great way where if you're trying to get people who have not had much experience with Elixir involved, you can kind of step them in here. And I have an example right here of Bumblebee. This is one of the existing ones where they showed off. Bumblebee, for those who don't know, is transformers, machine learning models, pre-trained transformer models where you can basically download them off of Hugging Face, and they'll run and they'll target NX, and you can even assign it the compiler. And you can go through here and you can fill out this form and kind of step through this and basically use this as you would like a graphical user interface on a web app, right? But this is built into Elixir, and then you can also see how this code is generated. So I think this is a great step in the learning and the offerings that Elixir has to draw new people in. Here's another example of one I wrote where basically Livebook is just a bunch of iframes. So each of these cells is an iframe. So when you write a plugin, you essentially have a whole iframe context to work within, and you can do whatever you want. So, I mean, not whatever you want, whatever you can do within an iframe. So for example, there was no easy way to use like YouTube to embed a YouTube video. So I think it took like 30 minutes to an hour to make this little plugin. And that's only because I wanted to use like the plugin API for, oh no, stop. Let me delete the Bumblebee one so we don't have to wait on that. There we go. And it is able to render your video within Livebook. So I think that that's just a few examples of some of the stuff I've been working on. And I think one of the biggest reasons that I'm really bullish on Livebook is because it's really, like I said, it scratches that itch of being at the intersection of, offering an easy front end to work with, extensibility to get developers involved, team oriented where you can have a bunch of different people, and offers this prototype to production kind of streamline. I had a couple other things where I was going to show. Basically, I also think kind of one of the last points, it's really good in terms of documentation. You can write now documentation where you're able to run your code as documentation. So this was some of the documentation I provided for EXGBoost. And what it does is it lets you walk through the documentation, be hands-on with it, and especially with something like plotting, it makes a lot of sense to do these things hands-on. This lives in the repo, and you can even, Livebook is just pure markup or markdown. So you can actually, right here's an example. This is just that same notebook, and it was a blog post. I was able to make it into a blog post. You can add a badge that says run in Livebook, and you can copy the code and basically end up running it the same way I had here, right? So Livebook is kind of my most recent thing that I've been really encouraged by. I think that there's a lot of room within Livebook that hasn't been scratched, right? I think there's still a lot of room. If you go look on the issue tracker, there's a lot of work being done on it. They're still looking at a lot of support for like LLM, for like code completion, extra stuff like that within Livebook. So there's a few demos. I had some final thoughts though. One of the biggest thing I think is there's a need to reduce adoption friction, right? And as I was kind of describing, I think Livebook is a great way to do this. We know where most people are coming from. We know most people are coming from like object-oriented for the most part. And we know, what the end person we're trying to appeal to is. So we should really try to speak in their terms. I was listening recently to some of the work or some stuff Jose was saying. He basically was saying that he doesn't like when people try to pitch. I won't say he doesn't like. He basically said he would reframe the pitch of like, here's why functional language is cool because it's like super math oriented, and instead focus on like how functional programming can reduce complexity. Because what you don't want to do is treat somebody as though they're coming in and they have like a plate full of stuff in their hands, like they're carrying some trays or something. You don't want to just be the person that adds to that, because if you're just adding to that, you're not going to finally get to the point where they're actually getting to your thing, right? If you're just saying like, this is cool because it's super mathy and here's what pure functional programming looks like, no side effects, immutability all the way. Like that might appeal to some people, but for most people in general, when they're really focused on problem solving, what you have to tell them is how they're going to reduce the complexity and how you're going to solve problems by taking problems away. And that's kind of how they were framing it. I think that makes a lot of sense. Minimize macro usage. This is kind of a more pragmatic talk. And I know that they're used in a lot of major libraries and they're really fun. And I think one of the biggest things I found is after I read Chris McCord's book about metaprogramming Elixir, despite all of his warnings about not writing macros and only doing them when absolutely necessary, my immediate thought was, wow, I need to find how I can use macros and just go crazy with macros. And I ended up getting nowhere with that because every time I did it, it was impossible to develop with, and it was impossible to troubleshoot. I ended up just reducing the complexity and not using macros. And now when I had to go back to doing smart cell development, where you use a lot of macros, because the whole thing when you're doing the code generation is essentially you're doing like code generation with macros. It was a lot easier to approach it from a stance of like, I know this is how I need to do this, rather than trying to shoehorn it into my problem. It's kind of like, don't go to it until you've expended all other options, right? Be a good steward of the language and the ecosystem. I've seen plenty of people do this. This isn't me saying this out of any sort of not seeing it happen, but I think it's, when I go on Elixir forum and I see people being proponents of it, people showing their successes with the language, those sorts of things will do more, in my opinion, to really sway people over than talking about the technical acumen or the technical tit for tat that one language offers over the other. I wrote, one of the articles I wrote was called from Elixir, or from Python like PyTorch to Elixir NX, and it was talking about how I ported some code from Python to Elixir, and it was really targeting like, hey, if this is what you want to do, if your goal is to implement something that's already in PyTorch and do it in Elixir, here's how you could do it. And one of the comments it got, ended up going at Hacker News, and somebody commented like, until I see a 17 or 70 billion parameter model trained on this language, and basically until I see it being used by OpenAI or being used by some major company, I'm not going to think twice about it. And I think that's an extremely wrong way to look at it, because obviously that's, if everybody had that approach, it would never happen. But at the same time, you're not going to win those people over by saying, it can do all these things because here's how we architected the language. Here's all of the technical reasons why this thing makes sense. What's really going to sway them is if they see that, right? If you decide to go out there, start using it for your company, start using it within your systems, and they go out and they see people using it, then that'll be what sways them. So that's kind of what I'm referring to as by be a good steward of the language. And that kind of leads into this last point, is refrain from diminishing other languages. I've seen a lot of conversations get shot down from the very beginning and turn hostile because one person framed it as Elixir is better than this language because of this. And so immediately you're putting the other person on the defensive. And if that's the argument you're trying to make, that's fine, but just don't expect a warm interaction, and don't expect to actually sway somebody's opinion when that's how you go about it. If you speak using like in the positive rather than in the negative, people are much more likely to appeal to, listen to your argument, even if your conclusion is the same thing, that they should forego another option to go with your option. Yeah, I also wanted to say, I really think writing is a big piece of this. These are a few of the ones I was kind of referencing earlier, that a lot of my writing as I was going on it early on was writing about how I was solving problems that I hadn't seen previously done. So I started, writing towards these things, and doing so made me a lot better, and also pointed out my flaws in a lot of ways, because I could write something, I could put it out into the world, and people could correct me. And if you don't do that, if you only keep things close to your chest and never tell anybody or never share your process, you might develop some competitive advantage if you're really good and you're really confident and you actually don't make those mistakes. But especially for me, with being a beginner, it was much more beneficial for me to put my work out there and get the necessary critique, feedback, and criticism than it was for me to just work in isolation, right? Some final thoughts. Writing is good. Share your progress. Either you'll learn because you'll be wrong, or you'll teach others something they didn't know. Elixir ecosystem is moving extremely fast. It's constantly improving. I'm really excited about the direction. And overall, I think people want less complexity in their lives. So if you can show them how your solution just reduces their complexity, takes something off their plate, then they'll be much more likely to move forward with it. Thank you. I appreciate the time. Yeah, that's all I have for today.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Nice,
Thanks for sharing.